It's not the bike, it's the rider. You've probably all heard this a few times, and I really do believe it. A skilled rider can make just about any motorcycle do incredible things. But if I had to choose one thing about my bike that goes a long way towards bettering my riding, it would be my suspension. When my suspension is working flawlessly, a few great things start to happen. I conserve energy, I gain confidence, and I build on my skill set. Fighting with your bike in the bouncy, rocky terrain should not be a thing. I mean, yes, rocks are tough, but you'd be amazed at how much easier that stuff becomes with suspension that does its job properly. Fighting to keep the rubber side down can drain your energy prematurely. Your forks and shocks should be absorbing the rough terrain, not bouncing and deflecting. Makes sense, right? Now, don't feel bad if you don't know the difference yet. I honestly didn't know until I finally found the correct setup. This is what was happening to me regularly before I finally got my setup figured out. Take a look at this. If you watch my back wheel, you can see that the shock is properly absorbing the impacts from the roots, and my rear wheel isn't coming off the ground. That is a clear sign that the suspension is doing its job. Now, same thing with my forks. My front wheel is staying on the ground, and the suspension is doing all the work. There's no bouncing and there's no deflection. This is a balanced setup in action. Okay, let's continue. Confidence. Ah, yes, this is a big one. There's nothing worse than coming up to a log on the trail and just praying to the dirt bike gods as you come barreling into it that everything is going to work out. Ideally, you want to be able to predict the outcome based on your skills, the conditions, the obstacle, etc. If you know exactly how your bike is going to handle and react, you're going to have the confidence to tackle the obstacle properly. Which then brings me to building on your skill set. With a comfortable and predictable bike setup comes progress. I noticed it immediately when I got my new suspension setup. Right away, I was able to eliminate one major variable, incorrectly set up suspension that is, and really focus on the steps to mastering a certain technique. So, what is a proper suspension setup? Your suspension should be sprung for your weight. From there, you can change the valving and adjust the clickers to what feels best for your riding style and the type of terrain you like to ride. I'm going to give you guys a quick tour of Suspension Works in Vancouver, British Columbia. This is where I had my suspension done. For those of you that are into the techie stuff, keep watching to hear from James, the man responsible for setting up my bike. He has changed my outlook on suspension completely. All right, so we're gonna start with my old bike. This thing had air forks in it, and we've made some changes. So James is gonna talk a little bit about that.
So with Megan's Husky, we've swapped over from the WP air system to a K-Tech coil conversion kit with external preload adjust. Obviously with coil, you've got more oil circulating in the forks, so it's going to be more consistent for longer rides. It's also going to be more consistent at higher altitude because air pressures can change at high altitude, especially here in BC. With this coil kit, we were able to modify it so we could lower the suspension ride height all around on this bike by 1 inch to match with Megan's new XCW. So then in the hydraulics of the fork, we swapped out the plastic mid valve that comes stock in this fork. It's not really revalvable or tunable, so we highly recommend swapping this out for an aluminum mid-valve system. The system we've gone with is from MX Tech in Chicago. We've had really good success with this mid-valve kit. We've done a lot of testing here in BC with it, and we've got a really nice valving code for enduro.
Okay, so I was having a lot of trouble with my rear shock on this bike, and this might be why.
So this is Megs' old shock body here, and if we can have a look inside there, we can see it's worn evenly the whole way around. It's just worn in one point here. So basically this would tell us that her suspension was set up super soft, and it was just basically just cycling in the one point all the time. So the back end of the bike was just sagging out on her big time. We've replaced this shock body with another WP one. We've also revalved her whole shock. We've changed the rebound circuit. We've changed the compression circuit. We've gone with an MX Tech low friction piston band as well on the piston to help prevent this wear. The low friction piston band gives a much better feel, better damping overall. Less friction means less heat, so more consistent riding. So as well on Megan's rear shock, when you actually lower the forks by 1 inch, you also have to lower the rear end. So this just gives you an idea of what a lowering spacer looks like. As you can see, it's got all these little slots in it here, because here we've got a low speed rebound bleed. And this allows the oil to flow freely on your low speed bleed. So it just sits there like that, and then your seal head just sits up against it. Okay, so we believe in a perfectly balanced bike. Lowering the bike all around gives you a more neutral geometry. It means the bike is going to want to turn in nicely, it's going to want to stand up nicely. It doesn't affect the kinematics and how the rear swing arm works, so you don't actually have to necessarily revalve to do to lower the suspension, to lower the ride height all around. Whereas with a lowering link, it can throw out the kinematics of the rear end and actually how the curve actually works. You may need to revalve, you may not, depending on the link, but also it changes the steering angle of the forks. So your bike is going to be sitting more at an angle because the back end is going to be lower than the front. It's going to lead to super loose steering. On tight corners and stuff, the bike might not want to turn in as nicely as lowering the suspension all around. As suspension works, we don't believe in a magic screwdriver. For us, it has to be sprung for your weight. If it's not sprung for your weight, then we can't make any adjustments. Most bikes these days come sprung for a 75 to 85 kilogram rider. You can also check out your owner's manual. At the bottom of your owner's manual, it should give you a spring chart to let you know what rate springs you should be on. So the first step is the bike sprung for your weight? Is the air pressure right for your weight? If it's not, you need to adjust your air pressure in the front. If you adjust your air pressure in the front, you may need to change your rear spring too. The next step is to adjust your sag. Make sure when you do adjust your sag that you're in all your riding gear. You've got your backpack on and it's full of water, you've got all your tools, because that's the only way you can properly set your sag. Yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to us. Remember, there's a lot of important information on tuning your chassis in your owner's manual. Remember, there's no such thing as a magic screwdriver. It's either sprung for your weight or it's not sprung for your weight. This is your first step to setting up your bike.
James has changed my outlook on suspension completely. If you're going to spend money on your bike, let it be on a proper suspension setup. Give the guys at Suspension Works a call, even if you just have a few questions. They'll be happy to help.